Hold on. Did you just take that out of my cart?
The shelf was empty. I need this more than you do.
That's not how this works. Put it back.
I'm not putting it back. First come, first serve, right? You hadn't even paid for it yet.
You can't just steal from people because you feel like you need it more.
Watch me.
Unbelievable.
She had just finished her shift. Her jacket was still on, her car keys still tucked in her pocket, and the shopping list she had typed on her phone during lunch was open on the screen as she moved her cart through the supermarket aisles. She had that focused efficiency of a mother who knows exactly what she needs, knows where to find it, and has only a limited amount of time before she has to get back home. It was a completely ordinary Tuesday, the kind that usually leaves behind no memorable moments, nothing worth retelling. But then she turned into the cereal aisle, stopped her cart, and reached for an item on the shelf. When she glanced back just moments later, something was off. A blonde woman stood on the opposite side of the aisle, holding a box that had clearly come from her cart, as casually as if it had always belonged to her. The supermarket security cameras were recording, as they always do. Their purpose is simple: to continuously capture every aisle, every interaction, every routine and unusual moment that takes place inside a public store. On that particular afternoon, in the cereal aisle, they recorded something that employees later described as one of the most unsettling interactions they had witnessed in years. Not because there was any violence, not because voices were raised or a confrontation turned physical, but because what unfolded was so obviously wrong and so clearly documented that watching it created a quiet discomfort. It was the kind that comes from seeing someone treated unfairly while everything around them continues as if nothing unusual is happening. The woman with the cart was named Danielle. She was 34 years old and had spent her entire day working as a pediatric speech therapist at a health center that helped children with communication challenges. She had stopped at that supermarket simply because it was on her way home, and because that morning, her 6-year-old son had asked for the yellow box cereal he liked, the one that had just run out at home. That same cereal box was now in the hands of the other woman. The blonde woman, wearing a beige sweater, had crossed into Danielle's space, reached into her cart, and took the box. Now she held it with the calm expression of someone who didn't understand why. They might be questioning someone who believed their actions were completely normal. What led her to do that was something she would later attempt to explain in different ways over the following weeks. Each explanation would be less convincing than the last because none of them could answer the most basic question the footage raised. Why take something from another person's cart? The woman's name, later revealed during the investigation, was Christina. According to her social media profile's information that would quickly spread once the case went viral, she was a lifestyle consultant, operating somewhere between a digital influencer and a wellness coach. Her brand revolved around presenting a life that looked organized, healthy, and aspirational. But what she did in that cereal aisle contradicted all of the camera had captured every second of it. Danielle looked at Christina with an expression the camera recorded in detail, one that anyone who has ever faced an unfair situation would instantly recognize. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was that calm disbelief that comes just before anger, when you're still trying to process whether what you're seeing is actually happening. She pointed toward the box in Christina's hands. Christina glanced at the cereal, then at the cart, then back at Danielle, and said something. The camera caught the moment, but the audio wasn't clear enough to understand her exact words. What was clear, however, was what happened next. And that moment marked the beginning of something neither Danielle nor Christina would finish the same way they had started that week. Danielle had entered the supermarket at 5:34 that afternoon, carrying a very specific kind of exhaustion. It wasn't purely physical, nor entirely mental. It was the unique fatigue that comes from working all day with young children. Something only those in pediatric care truly understand. She had seen 11 children that day. She had conducted 3 language development assessments, attended 2 meetings with parents, and participated in 1 session with the center's multidisciplinary team. By the time she left work, she had that familiar feeling of having given everything she had during those hours. What remained now was the time meant for her and her son. That time started with her shopping list and would end with the dinner she had already planned on her way to the store. The cereal aisle was third on that list. She had already picked up items from the first 2 aisles without any issue, even exchanged a quick greeting with an employee she recognized from her regular visits. She entered the cereal aisle with a partially filled cart, her attention split between the shelves in front of her and her phone, where a message from her son asked what time she'd be home. She paused, replied to him, then looked up to find the yellow cereal box. She turned slightly to grab it from the shelf. That small movement lasted no more than 15 seconds, and when she turned back, Christina was already there. Christina had entered the aisle from the opposite side. The security footage showed her walking in with a shopping basket hooked over her arm, no carton, moving along the shelves with the focused posture of someone searching for a specific item. As she passed Danielle's cart, which had been left in the middle of the aisle while Danielle reached toward the shelf, the camera captured something both simple and deeply unsettling. Christina paused. She looked at the cart, glanced at the surrounding shelves, and then calmly extended her hand into the cart, lifting out the cereal box. The motion was so effortless, so completely without hesitation, that it seemed as though it never once occurred to her that the cart belonged to someone else or that she was taking something that wasn't hers. Danielle saw it happen just as she was turning back, holding another cereal box she had picked up from the shelf. She froze for a brief moment, processing what she had just witnessed. Then she did what anyone in that situation would reasonably do. She asked, directly but without raising her voice, whether Christina had just taken that item from her cart. The question was clear enough to be picked up by the camera's audio. Christina's reaction was what shifted the moment from a simple misunderstanding into something else entirely. It was the point at which anyone watching the footage later agreed this was not going to end with a quick apology and the return of the item. Because Christina did not give the box back. Instead, she looked at Danielle with that same expression the camera had already captured, an expression of confusion at being questioned. Land began to respond. The audio system didn't record every word clearly, but it captured enough fragments for attorneys later to reconstruct the substance of what was said. Christina's explanation, though phrased in slightly different ways throughout the exchange, always circled back to the same central idea. She had taken the cereal because she wanted that specific box, and there had only been one left on the shelf and that one had been in Danielle's cart. She didn't say it like someone realizing they had made a mistake. She said it as if the reasoning itself was perfectly sufficient, requiring no apology or further justification. That logic that wanting something and seeing only one available made it acceptable to take it from someone else was so completely dismissive of Danielle's equal right to the item that Danielle paused, unsure how to respond immediately. Not because she lacked words, but because the response was so obvious that having to explain it to another adult created a different kind of exhaustion. It was a familiar kind of fatigue, the kind that comes from having to state something that should never need, stating that you have the same right to exist and act in a shared space as anyone else. Recognizing that feeling, standing there in a supermarket aisle on a Tuesday after a long day of work, was the moment Danielle decided she wouldn't simply let it go. The exchange between the two women lasted just over 3 minutes, according to the camera timestamp. 3 minutes captured clearly enough to show their body language, the cereal box remaining in Christina's hands the entire time, and the exact moment a store employee entered the aisle, drawn by the rising tension in their voices. The employee, a young woman in a green uniform, appeared from the far end of the aisle, her expression uncertain as she approached, not yet aware of what she was stepping into. She would later become one of the most important witnesses, not because she had seen how it started, but because she arrived early enough to see what mattered. During those 3 minutes, Christina's explanation shifted repeatedly as Danielle responded. At first, Christina leaned on the idea of scarcity. There had been only one box, and she needed that exact cereal for a recipe she planned to make. When Danielle pointed out that the reason there was only one box was because she had already placed it in her cart, the narrative changed. Christina began suggesting that Danielle didn't really need that specific cereal, that there were other options on the shelf that would work just as well, and that it would be easier if Danielle simply chose something else. That suggestion that Danielle should give up the item from her own cart for Christina's convenience was the moment the employee realized this wasn't a simple mix-up that could be resolved with a quick apology. Danielle then asked directly, without any detours, for the box to be returned. Christina still didn't give it back. Instead, she did something. The camera captured clearly something that would later become one of the most discussed details when the video spread publicly. She turned slightly and placed the cereal box into her own shopping basket. The movement had a sense of finality, as though the issue had been settled simply because she had decided it was. It was a gesture that only makes sense if you assume the other person will accept the outcome without further resistance. Danielle did not. She reached toward Christina's basket with the clear intention of taking back what was hers. Christina stepped back. That was the moment the employee intervened, asking both women to come with her to customer service. Their walk to the front of the store was captured by 2 additional cameras positioned along the aisles they passed through. Those recordings completed the timeline in a way that left no room for ambiguity. Christina continued carrying the basket with Danielle's cereal box still inside, while Danielle walked beside the employee. Composed but controlled in a very deliberate way. Her posture reflected restraint, the kind that comes from knowing that reacting proportionally in that moment wasn't appropriate for the setting, and that her behavior could matter later in ways she couldn't yet predict. That visible self-control present in every frame reflected an awareness often carried in public spaces, an awareness that comes with its own cost, even if that cost isn't visible on camera. At the customer service counter, the situation was presented to a supervisor named Marcus. He was 32 years old, with 6 years of experience at that store, and he listened to both sides with the expression of someone who had handled enough disputes to recognize when something wasn't a simple misunderstanding. Danielle explained the situation clearly and in order. Christina offered a different version, one that had evolved again, suggesting there may have been confusion about which cart belonged to whom. It was an explanation, directly contradicted by the footage, though she delivered it with confidence, seemingly unaware that everything had been recorded. Marcus excused himself, went to the back office, and reviewed the relevant footage. It took less than 4 minutes. When he returned, his demeanor had noticeably shifted. He asked Christina to return the cereal box to Danielle immediately, issued a formal apology on behalf of the store, and informed Christina that the general manager would be notified of the incident. Depending on that review, she could be restricted from returning to the store. Christina's reaction at that moment was different from anything the cameras had captured earlier. It was the expression of someone beginning to realize too late that the assumptions she had walked in with were not going to be validated by the reality around her. The cameras recorded it all without judgment, just as they had recorded everything else, unaware of how significant those moments would become later. Danielle left the store that afternoon with the yellow cereal box back in her cart and with something else she hadn't expected to carry home, a clear decision not to let the incident go. She had spent enough years in environments where she had to prove her competence to people who underestimated her before she even spoke. She recognized the specific fatigue that comes not from work, but from navigating situations where her presence is quietly questioned. And she knew, with the same certainty she applied in her professional work, that ignoring what had happened would mean accepting it. She didn't accept it. While still in the parking lot, she called her older sister, a legal assistant at a civil law firm. Her sister listened without interrupting, then asked a single direct question: were there security cameras in the cereal aisle? Danielle confirmed there were cameras in nearly every aisle and that Marcus had already reviewed the footage before returning the item and apologizing. There was a brief pause before her sister responded Danielle needed to formally request that footage before it was overwritten. In most supermarkets, recordings are automatically archived within 48 to 72 hours. Danielle ended the call, went back inside, and asked to speak with the general manager. The manager, Robert, had already been informed by Marcus and had reviewed the footage himself before Danielle arrived. At 51 years old, with over 2 decades of experience in retail, he had developed the ability to recognize when a situation might escalate beyond a routine dispute. What he had seen in the recordings was clear. When Danielle explained what she needed, he assured her the footage would be preserved and that she could receive a copy through a formal written request, which he offered to prepare immediately. She agreed. The document was created on the spot, including the date and time, confirming that the store acknowledged the incident, that video evidence existed, and that it would be made available through proper legal channels. Robert also confirmed, in response to Danielle's question, that Christina was a registered customer in the store's loyalty program, meaning her details were on file and that access to the store could be restricted depending on the outcome of the internal review. That detail, seemingly routine at the time, would later become important in ways Robert may not have fully anticipated. That same evening, after putting her son to bed, Danielle sat alone in her kitchen, replaying the day with the quiet clarity that comes once everything else has settled. She had explained the delay to her son in simple terms, leaving out the heavier details, but enough for him to understand why she had come home later than expected and why something felt different. That conversation stayed with her. More than anything else that day, it clarified what mattered. She was raising a young black boy in a world that had once again shown how differently presence in public spaces could be treated, and she didn't want the lesson he learned to be silence or acceptance. 2 days later, she met with an attorney who specialized in discrimination cases involving commercial establishments. He had handled similar cases before, but none with evidence as clear as what Danielle had secured. When he reviewed the footage, his conclusion was immediate. The video showed a sequence of events that supported multiple legal claims without needing interpretation. It clearly documented the unauthorized removal of the cereal box from Danielle's cart, leaving no room for Christina's claim of confusion. It also captured Christina's refusal to return the item when directly confronted just as clearly. Christina's conduct at the customer service counter added another layer of legal weight to the evidence Danielle had preserved. There, she presented a version of events that the footage directly contradicted, strengthening the case against her. Over the next 3 weeks, the lawsuit was carefully built using a method that reflected both the strength of the evidence and the attorney's experience with cases where the opposing side tends to downplay events until the evidence makes that impossible. The strategy itself was straightforward but demanded precision. Every claim would be tied to a specific, verifiable moment from the footage. Any attempt by Christina to present an alternative version would have to confront clear visual evidence that contradicted it. There was no room for interpretation. The cameras had captured everything, every movement, every gesture, every second from the cereal aisle to the customer service counter. The case was structured in 3 reinforcing layers. The first was the most direct and easiest to prove: unauthorized taking of personal property. The cereal box had been in Danielle's cart before any interaction occurred, and the footage clearly showed Christina removing it without asking, without permission, and without any sign of confusion. In fact, one critical detail made that argument even stronger. Christina had entered the aisle carrying only a shopping basket, not a cart. There was no plausible way she could have mistaken Danielle's cart for her own, and the camera angle made that unmistakably clear. The second layer went beyond the single incident. Danielle's attorney conducted a thorough review of Christina's public history and uncovered a pattern of similar behavior. While none of those prior incidents had reached court, they were still traceable. There had been a complaint at a local coffee shop. An account shared in an online consumer group described a similar situation at an organic market. And after the supermarket footage began circulating, at least 2 additional individuals came forward voluntarily, reporting comparable experiences. None of those earlier situations had been recorded. None had led to consequences. Danielle's case was different on both counts. The third layer was the most serious and the most concerning for Christina's legal team. Her attorney, hired 2 days after she received notice of the lawsuit, requested access to the footage, likely expecting to find some ambiguity that could be used in her defense. Instead, he found what everyone else saw: a clear, uninterrupted sequence of events, recorded with enough clarity to directly support each claim being made. This final layer argued that Christina's behavior, when viewed alongside the documented pattern and the way she treated Danielle compared to others visible in the footage, amounted to racial discrimination in a public setting. It was the kind of claim that required evidence of a broader pattern, and the case had been constructed to demonstrate exactly that. Because Christina had a public identity as a lifestyle consultant, the case did not remain confined to the legal system. As the lawsuit progressed and journalists began requesting access to the footage, the video gradually became public. The reaction online was immediate. Her audience, people who had followed her for guidance on lifestyle and wellness, were now watching footage of her taking an item from another person's cart and refusing to return it. The gap between her carefully curated image and the behavior shown in the video was too large to ignore, and the response spread quickly across platforms. Brands that had partnered with her began to distance themselves. Two sponsors ended active contracts within a week of the footage gaining traction. An online platform that hosted her wellness courses quietly removed her content without issuing a public statement to silence that spoke volumes about their internal assessment. At the same time, Danielle's legal team began reaching out to Christina's attorney to discuss a possible settlement. The timing was deliberate. Legal pressure and reputational damage were unfolding simultaneously, increasing the cost of going to trial with each passing week. Formal negotiations began on a Thursday afternoon, 5 weeks after the incident. Christina's attorney opened with a low offer, the kind often used to test the other side's position rather than to be accepted. Danielle's attorney declined it without presenting a counteroffer, signaling that they were in no rush and that time was not working in Christina's favor. That lack of urgency had a purpose. Each week without resolution meant continued damage to Christina's professional standing, followers disengaging, partnerships dissolving, and the gradual collapse of a personal brand built over years. None of it had been orchestrated by Danielle. It was simply the result of clear evidence meeting public scrutiny. But its impact added pressure that the courtroom alone could not create. By the second round of negotiations, the offer had improved significantly, though it still didn't meet Danielle's terms. It did, however, confirm that Christina's side understood the direction the case was heading. Danielle's attorney responded with a precise counteroffer. It included not only financial compensation reflecting the harm caused, but also a set of non-financial conditions that Danielle had decided were essential and non-negotiable. Those conditions traced back to the decision she made that night in her kitchen after putting her son to bed, and nothing in the process had shifted that decision. The final agreement was signed on a Monday morning, 6 weeks and 4 days after the incident. The financial amount remained confidential, as both parties agreed, but parts of the non-financial terms were made public at Danielle's insistence. She successfully argued that transparency served a broader public interest. One key requirement stood out. Christina was obligated to complete a structured educational program focused on racial bias and discrimination in public spaces. Completion had to be verified by an independent entity within a set time frame. It was the condition Christina's defense had resisted most likely because it required a clear form of acknowledgement. For that same reason, it was the one Danielle had insisted on most firmly. In the months that followed, Christina largely disappeared from public view. Her social media platforms went quiet or showed only minimal activity. The brand she had spent years building had been significantly damaged, and any attempt to rebuild it would require time and effort she had yet to demonstrate publicly. There were no public statements, no attempts at a redemption narrative, no visible indication of reflection beyond an awareness that consequences had followed. Whether deeper reflection was happening privately remained unknown. What was certain, however, was that a 3-minute moment in a supermarket aisle captured on a security camera had changed the course of 2 lives in profoundly different ways. Danielle returned to work the following week. 2 weeks later, she returned to the same supermarket because it was close to her home and because there was no reason she should have to change her routine. She continued raising her son, having the same necessary and often difficult conversations about navigating a world that does not always treat people equally. The settlement provided financial support, which she directed partly toward her son's education and partly toward an organization offering free legal assistance to individuals facing discrimination in commercial spaces but lacking the resources to pursue justice. That decision was intentional, and it was the first one she made after the agreement was finalized. Because what she had come to understand through the entire process was this: the difference between what happened to her and what continues to happen to others without consequence wasn't that her case mattered more. It was that she had access to resources many people don't. And as long as that gap exists, the only meaningful response is to use what you have to help close it.